Happy Thursday. Sorry, I'm just stalling as people come in the door. I'm Rachel Scheinerman, and you have landed in the My Jewish Learning Weekly Daf Yomi Enlightening Review. We spend 30 minutes reviewing some highlights of what we did this week in Tractate Sanhedrin. We are, of course, joined by a rotating group of wonderful teachers for this class. And this morning we have Rabbi Ari Sachs. Rabbi Sachs, I think we're all in the door. Why don't you go ahead and get started?
Wonderful. Well, it is a pleasure to be with you again, everyone, to learn together today. It is the last time I was here was for the celebration of Talmud learning, and it was my first time being able to come together with all the other teachers and just to see their styles, and want to offer a big yisher koach to Rachel Scheinerman for coordinating it, for making it happen. And if you have anything wonderful to say about the celebration, if you were there, please feel free to put it into the chat for that hakarat hatov, because it was such a great pleasure to be a part of this study. And I also share with you that in my work as a rabbi in Rhode Island, that was talking with a member of the congregation about Talmud, and she said, it's always been very daunting for me. And I talked to her about what My Jewish Learning does with this program, and says there are ways to be able to get into the learning. You don't have to start from the beginning. You start where everyone is. So whether this is your first time here, your 1,000th time, you've been with us since Brachot Daf Bet, whatever it may be, that it is such a joy to be able to learn with you. And so with that, we're going to get into the learning from Masechet Sanhedrin. There is a link to the source sheet that you have, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually share my screen so that hopefully you'll be able to see it in case you cannot. The topic that I want to talk about today, I'm going to do a little bit differently than I've done in the past, is I actually want to have a little bit of a conversation. I know I can't be necessarily with everyone, but I hope that some of you will be able to chime in. And it has to do with the role that judges play and that witnesses play in helping come to the truth of what is right and what is wrong.
Oh.
So with that in mind, I want to kind of backtrack for a second. For those, I am living in Philadelphia. I am a big Philadelphia Eagles fan, and so I'm very excited about this weekend, and hopefully for that into the future. If you're not, then it's okay. No one's perfect. But what I will say is that in getting into a little bit of this season, I've actually watched a video about NFL referees. And one of the most interesting thing about referees is that they don't necessarily care about whether or not that they made a mistake. What they care about is getting the call right, and that they work together as a team to make sure that they get the call right, because making sure that people are able to play by the rules is what's most important. And to a certain degree, I actually think that that's a good framing for the question about judges and how they deal with witnesses and how they deal with judgments in our particular pages of Sanhedrin, which runs from pages 30 through 37. Because whereas with referees, they don't necessarily care if they individually get the question, get the judgment wrong, but that they want to work together as a team to make sure they get it right. What the judges are interested in is how to ensure that in getting the answer right, they don't embarrass the judges who they think may be wrong. And one of the most interesting things I think about Talmud is that we talk about how Talmud is a study of, well, you get position A, position B, you've got so many Jews with so many opinions, but in fact, Talmud is about getting the right answer. And what's so fascinating about the study of Talmud is that when it comes to getting the right answer, you can have very different opinions in one generation. And then the job of later generations is to say, well, this one Tana, this one older rabbi, got it right in this way. And this other Tana who disagreed with him got it right in another way. As if to say, it's not about many different opinions. It's about how they're both right. That becomes a little bit harder when you are in the midst of judgment, when you're trying to figure out in a case that you are adjudicating what is the right answer, especially when you have people coming in, you have witnesses coming in who have different stories. And what is the right witness? How many witnesses do you need? One of the most fascinating comments in our learning is the notion that when the Torah says to bring an aid, to bring a witness, that the Talmud interprets that as inherently two witnesses. That it means adim, means double witnesses. Why does it say one witness? It says one witness because their opinions will support each other almost as if it's one. So even when it comes to thinking about the witnesses coming in, we have to make sure that they are united, even if they come from different perspectives, let alone when it comes to judgment. Because whether you're talking about a monetary case or a ritual case, or especially a capital case, we're very worried about what happens if we get it wrong. So with that in mind, I want to share with you my screen. We're going to take a look at one snippet or two snippets, hopefully, of the teaching that I want to focus on today to kind of really give that idea of how judges can be able, or I should say, to how judges should work to get the answer right when they're dealing with other judges who may have different opinions. Okay, so we're going to start with this text, which comes from Sanhedrin 31a. I'm going to read again. I'm going to read the English here, which for those who are new, for those who have not necessarily been a part of our learning, one important thing to know is that anything in the bold is a direct translation from the text. Everything not in bold is a commentary on the text in order to help you understand what is being said. The commentary comes from Rabbi Adin Steinsaltz, who relies a lot on Rashi to be able to explain what's happening in the text. And it is somewhat of an opinion. It's not necessarily the actual direct text itself. So here we go. The Mishnah teaches, and from where is it derived that when the judge leaves the courtroom, he should not say, I deemed you exempt and my colleagues deemed you liable. But what can I do as my colleagues outnumbered me and consequently you were deemed liable? Okay. Now I'm actually going to take this. I'm going to stop the share for a moment. If I can figure out, oh, there it is. All right. Now, hopefully you have the text in front of you, but I want you to just think about that line. How can a judge go out in public and say, I thought that, let's say Rachel was right, but I was voted down and Rachel ended up being wrong? The text is saying that we don't do that. Can you think of an example, or let me put it another way? Do you think that that's how judges act today? Do you think that that's how judges act today, or is it different than how judges act today? And I'm wondering if we can get any raised hands to get maybe two opinions here. And Rachel, if you'd be able to call on maybe a couple of folks. Wait, hold on a second. Rachel, you're muted.
Whoops.
There you go.
All right. Betsy, you should be on.
Yeah, the Supreme Court.
So
you look at the presiding or the majority opinion and the minority. They say, well, I think this is right. He was wrong, basically. Although
except that, in fact, I think that what the Talmud is saying is directly opposite of what the Supreme Court says, what the Supreme Court does. Almost as if to say that the Supreme Court is, when you have a minority opinion, they're saying, oh, guess what? I wish we were right, but these folks are wrong. And here's how I know that I'm right, but I just couldn't win the case. And
well,
what the
they
Talmud
sort of say that in their dissenting opinion.
Right.
And sometimes it's pretty caustic.
Yeah, it is. It can be very caustic. Anyone else have
Talmud.
Anyone else? The Tom is definitely very caustic. I think we have Pepita. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Well,
Okay.
I'm a former judge.
Oh, perfect.
But not a rabbi. I like in the regular courts in Canada. And I have to say, our more polite appeal courts, and not all of them and not always, would, even if they disagree with a lower court's judgment, they will take the time to explain why that could have been but for a small discrepancy in understanding of the evidence or the law.
Right.
I have to say, unfortunately, that's not always the case. And
Sometimes they have that caustic opinion.
Yes.
Right. Well, and thank you for Pepita, because in many ways, what you just talked about is what earlier in our text they were talking about in regards to, I forget exactly which rabbi it was, or two rabbis that were saying how in this case they were right, but in this other case that we're actually dealing with, they were wrong. So that it's a way to save both of them. But to come back to our text for a moment, and 1 second. And Betsy, this is to the point that you're saying about thinking of the Supreme Court. About this, it is stated, you shall not go as a talebearer among your people, coming from the book of Leviticus. And it says, one who goes about as a talebearer reveals secrets, but one who is of a faithful spirit conceals a matter. So one of the interesting things to think about judges is that it's a little bit different than the way that judges worked back in times of the Talmud than what we have as judges now. The minimum number of judges you need to have are 3. That's the minimum number you need for a court. So like a Beit Din, if you need to get converted, you have 3. But the basic idea of a Beit Din was this. You have one judge who kind of acts as a lawyer for the plaintiff. And then you have another judge who kind of acts as a judge for the accused. And then you have one judge who kind of settles the matter between. That the third, Hamechachashim zeh et zeh, will determine one versus the other. So that's why you have 3. That's why it's important to have that basic level of 3. And what it's saying here is that whenever the judges come together as those 3, you have both opinions as to why it could go either way, but there can only be one opinion for a court to make a judgment. And what this is saying here is that once you come together as a court, it has to be unanimous. It has to be 3-0, or it has to be 9-0, has to be 12-0 or so. Just like we think about with a jury, it has to be unanimous, and you cannot go about to other folks and say, oh, this other judge was wrong and I should have been right. And the importance of that is because it respects the authority of the court. One of the main things that I think is fascinating thinking about the Supreme Court is that many chief justices, including the current chief justice of the court, talks a lot about the institution itself and the role that institution needs to continue to play out. Now, many folks might disagree about the chief justices or any chief justice's way of going about doing it. But the point of any judge, especially a leader of a court, that third judge, is to make sure that when people get the judgment, they'll listen and that they will come back for more judgments later on. As if to say that if you go about telling what happened behind the scenes, then no one's going to trust the court at all. And that's what it means by in terms of revealing secrets. And the extent of that is fascinating. If we take a look at the next section of Talmud, there actually is a story that really relates to the notion of letting people know what happened behind the scene and how detrimental that can be to the effective judgment. The Gemara relates there was a certain student about whom a rumor emerged that he revealed a statement that was stated in the study hall. Again, not even talking about a court, but talking about in the study hall, and that should have been kept secret. And the rumor emerged 22 years. 22 years. Like, think about how long. Think about what you were doing 22 years ago. And if you revealed a secret back then, like, I totally forget what it is. But the importance of it here is that rumor emerged 22 years after the time the statement was revealed. Rav Ami removed him from the study hall as a punishment because he said, this person is a revealer of secrets and he cannot be trusted. And he cannot be trusted. So the importance of especially judges, of rabbis, to make sure that if you are working on a judgment and you have different opinions, that you can have those disagreements in private, but you cannot have it in public. I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts to that idea. Can we get 1 or 2 thoughts to that notion of keeping everything in private and not necessarily sharing all that in public? So I see that we have Michael Stock.
Hi there.
Hi, Michael.
Hi, how are you? I was fascinated to listen to the judge that you just had before. So I'm a retired financial analyst with the Standard and Poor's rating agency. And our ratings are based upon not a court, but a committee. And the
Mm,
rules you just went through are exactly the rules we had at Standard and Poor's. As a matter
mm,
of fact, to illustrate what you just said, in my 30 years there, one person, you were talking about the student that 20 years, that after 20 years revealed a secret, one person actually publicly stated his own opinion and he agreed with, and he disagreed with the committee, and S&P fired him immediately and walked him out of the our
wow.
company in within 24 hours. That's how
Right.
serious it was taken.
I appreciate that, to know that this a statement like this is still relevant for us today. Thank you, Michael.
It's how the financial industry, at least the committees of the financial industry, work.
Wow. Thank you, Michael. We have Pepita again.
Okay,
Please.
I was just thinking that the advantage of having different opinions being made public,
Mhm.
and I think that happened with the rabbis as well, is later on a future generation could look at the dissenting opinion and say, maybe there was more to it, and it was important to have it said, because if it had been hidden, nobody would be able to draw the new inferences.
So I think that is, first off, a very important point to be made about the nature of Talmud study, especially because who is the audience that the Talmud is written for? Like, is this a public display of rabbinic knowledge that everyone would have access to? Or was this kind of the textbook that you would get when you went to study in school and they said, don't bring it out in public, we can't let anybody else see it? It's almost it's very secret to us. By the way, just as a point to that, the Bible itself is a very fascinating story of who had the right to have a copy of the Bible, who had the right to translate the Bible, because if you give the Bible to people, people come up with their own ideas of what is right and what is wrong, and they won't necessarily listen to the quote unquote authoritative views that enable the Bible to continue to be viewed as an authority. So the question of access to information is not necessarily from the perspective of whether we're talking about this particular aspect of Talmud, or Pepita, your point about having dissenting opinions around or just available. The question of access to knowledge is not so clear cut, because an argument could be made that you should not give everyone access to knowledge, because then it would dilute the effect of that knowledge on helping people live lives according to a certain way of life. There's too many opinions, there's too many cooks in the kitchen. Or to Pepita, to your point, if you want an institution to be able to be flexible and to grow over the course of time, then you need to be able to bring in opinions that may have been minor, 100 years ago, but now is a given, right? If you think about the role that women have played in Jewish society, if you have the story of the daughters of Tzlofchad, that they asked Moses for, to get the inheritance from their father who passed away. There were no sons who he could give it to. They wanted it. And in many ways, that was kind of a case that was brought to court, and they published it in the Torah. So that now we have that as an example of how women have a right in that ancient culture. And though it is not necessarily the same thing as giving women the kind of rights that women should expect today, it was a foundational text to say, see, even back then, we were concerned about the role that women played in society. So having those other opinions, having those dissenting opinions in public allows us to be able to grow a tradition. And I think that is a very important tension that exists within the context of our sugya here today. There's one other piece I want to share that is related to this, but talks about it in a different way, which has to do, I think, with, you might call it the more emotional side, or to put it another way, judges are humans too. And no one wants to be embarrassed. No one wants to be told, especially if you took that role, that, oh, you're just dumb. You just don't know the law. You are just, you're doing it for your own purposes. And sometimes we can be very caustic in the way that we speak. And the rabbis are very keen, they're very aware of that emotional dynamic, that the teaching that if you embarrass somebody, it is as if you have destroyed a life, is something that's very in tune, or I should say the rabbis of the Talmud were very in tune with. I think it's one of the reasons why they spend a lot of time trying to make different opinions from previous generations actually work together like a jigsaw puzzle, that the pieces just, those pieces that you think work together, especially in the 1,000-piece puzzle, you think they work together, but they don't. They almost kind of fit. It's almost like they're trying to do that with the opinions of the rabbis from previous generations. Sometimes it fits, sometimes it doesn't, but the intention is to make those pieces a part of the same puzzle. And that's actually related in the final section I want to talk about today, when it has to do with monetary cases and capital cases, or monetary cases, ritual cases, and capital cases. So just to kind of back up for a second, if you think about how we have in our law system, we have criminal law and civil law, and there are different levels by which certain judgments can be made in civil court versus in criminal court. In criminal court, you need a jury to be unanimous. In civil court, you don't necessarily need to. You can be you could call it maybe a lower level. To some degree, that idea of having certain levels of judgment is reflected in the text we're about to read regarding different courts or different matters, which is having to do with monetary, ritual purity, and capital cases. So here we have Sanhedrin 32a. In cases of monetary law, and likewise in the cases of ritual impurity and purity, the judges commence expressing their opinions from the greatest of the judges. The greatest of the judges, which in the Hebrew is matchilin min hagadol, right? Hagadol here can just mean the greatest. It doesn't necessarily mean the greatest adjudicator of law, the most senior person in law. It just means the greatest. However, in cases of capital law, the judges commence issuing their opinions from the side where the least significant judges sit. Dinei nefashot, capital cases, matchilin min hatzad. It's almost like, you have the ones who really know what they're doing. They're sitting in the middle. They're the presiding judge, and the ones who just got onto the court, their first year or so, they don't necessarily know as much. They come from the side. They're sitting kind of a little bit off over there. When I first read this, I was confused because I'm thinking, all right, if monetary and purity cases are, for lack of a better comparison, like civil law, I would think that you would want to start with the least significant judges. They're the ones who can make that law because, it's not as significant, let's say capital cases, and the text does say this in other places, that it's very heavy, it's very important, and you need to absolutely get it right because you're talking about someone's life here. But in fact, it says the opposite, right? It says the opposite. Start with the greatest of the judges for capital cases, but start with the least significant, start with the greatest of judges for monetary and impurity or ritual purity cases. But when it comes to capital cases, start with the least significant judges. Well, Rashi helps understand this. And I think that the way the Rashi explains it is really powerful in thinking about the emotional and psychological and human component of what it means to make a judgment in a certain matter, both for the accused and for the people involved in the case, and especially for the judges who are trying to work together to come up again with what the right rule is. So this is what Rashi says. He says, min hatzad, talking about from the side, right? What does it mean by the least significant judges? Min haketanim. Sorry, let me back up for a second. I didn't actually put this here. He first actually talk about the gadol. When Rashi understands gadol, he doesn't mean the most important judge. He doesn't mean the judge that is the most senior, the chief judge, the one who kind of makes the decisions at the end of the day. He's talking about the one who has the greatest knowledge in a certain area, right? If you go to law school, if you go to any school, you get a general understanding of the law, but then you might have a specific area that you're saying, I really want to know this. I want to know every little detail. And that person may not necessarily ever go to become the chief judge, but they really know that law. So when it says gadol here, it doesn't necessarily mean the person who's going to make the final decision because they're the chief justice. What it's saying is you want to go to the judge who knows the most about this issue, who understands it, who's the expert here. And what's more, you start there because then you can rely upon that expert opinion for others who may not necessarily have as much knowledge, right? If you start with someone's basic opinion who doesn't really know anything, and then the other person who's coming in who says, I know this law, so let me tell you, like, why are we talking about this? Let me just start. You can also create conflict among the judges because the way in which judges, I think, or the idea here, the way in which they show respect to each other is to give each other the benefit of the doubt that they know what they're talking about, and to also have the humility to know when they don't know as much as the other, when they don't have as much expertise. And so that's the point here. When you're talking about these cases of monetary and purity rules, that what Rashi is saying here is that you need to go to the person who has the most knowledge of this, because there can be kind of esoteric points here. There can be very detailed minutia. So start there and have the humility to start with the person, even if they may not necessarily be the most significant judge in the courtroom, they're the most significant judge on that issue. Okay, so that's gadol. But the part of the minat sad, this least significant judge, I think is the most fascinating thing, again, having to do with that emotional connection, understanding the role that judges play. And here's what he says, minat sad, min haktanim, from the ones who are of the lesser significant judges, shema yechayevnu hagadol, velo yirtzu lachalok al dvarav. You start with the least significant judges because, or lest that they feel that they have to abide by the most significant judge, by the chief justice. If you have a colleague who is more senior and you start with their opinion, then that person's opinion is going to weigh on whether or not you think it's right or wrong. And because that's a human thing, you don't necessarily want to start, or I should say, if you want to be part of a team, you want to be a team player. So you may have to eat. You may have to eat an idea if someone more senior than you comes and says, I know what the right answer is. So what do? You start with the lower court. And by the way, when I was reading this, I was thinking about the way in which there are cases in which lawyers try to bring their case all the way to the Supreme Court because they want to move quickly on it. They don't want to go through the process. But the Supreme Court then says, no, you have to start with the process. We want the lower courts. We want the ones that are, quote unquote, lesser significant, because they may have important points that we don't necessarily know about. And if you start with us, no other court is going to come and give you a different ruling. We need to see what all the other rulings are before we can make our judgments. So let someone else have a chance to be able to make their opinion heard before you end up with the person who's going to end up having to kind of lead us to make a bigger decision, meaning to make the final decision. Because at the end of the day, this is what all judges are concerned about. Mishum lo ta'aneh al riv. As it says in the book of Shmot in chapter 23, verse 2, you shall neither side with the mighty to do wrong. You shall not give perverse testimony in a dispute so as to pervert it in favor of the mighty. And by the way, if you continue that on, it also says that you shall not neither side with the lesser off, with the weak, in order to do right. That you need to do what is just right by virtue of what the law says. And you need to show respect for all of the different players involved, for all the different judges involved, even if you disagree with them, but actually would say, especially when you disagree with them. And I think that our text here gives us a good framework for how those in power can be able to make decisions that are going to affect people's lives in the way that shows the best kind of menschlichkeit that they can have.
Thank you, Rabbi Sachs. Always a pleasure to learn with you. Thank you to everybody on this call who participated. Always learn from you guys too, who have done so many interesting things with your lives and have so much insight to share with us. Always appreciated. This is one of the best parts of my week, but it's drawing to a close. So Shabbat Shalom, everybody. We will meet you again in this space in exactly 1 week's time.
All right. Take care, everyone.